117 billion. That is the estimated amount of people that have lived since Homo sapiens emerged about 190,000 years ago. That means, according to basic Steiner math, that 109 billion people have died, which is about 14 times the amount of people alive today. And even still, with all of these deaths, no one has been able to prove definitively that ghosts are real. However, physicists have been able to prove the opposite, that ghosts are in fact not real. And we could make a list 100 reasons long to explain why ghosts don't exist, but I'ma just go with my favorite one. According to Sir Brian Cox,
if ghosts were composed of any sort of energy or particle that interacts with our world, they would have been detected by the Large Hadron Collider.
That may be the worst Brian Cox impression ever, but it's what he said that's important. But let me just explain quickly what the Large Hadron Collider is. In Geneva, Switzerland, there is a 27-kilometer underground ring that accelerates particles, protons, and ions near to the speed of light and then smashes them together. And this effectively recreates conditions similar to those that would have been observed after the Big Bang. Now, because of studies and experiments done with the Large Hadron Collider, an international team of scientists, including Sir Brian Cox, discovered a new particle. This particle is known as the Higgs boson particle, but is nicknamed famously the God particle. And to explain it very basically, this God particle basically explains how things acquire mass.
Sort of acting like a glue that allows for a structured universe.
You know, so basic physics. Anyway, the point is that if anything was found there that would explain how ghosts are able to operate in our universe, it would have been discovered with the Large Hadron Collider. It is almost inconceivable to think that any sort of particle that would explain how ghosts work would have been missed by the Large Hadron Collider. So to me, that makes sense. However, there are some big brains on the internet. Now, I've been reading through some discussions online, and a common argument that I see is that science is constantly learning and finding new things. Some things weren't known or discovered until recently, blah blah blah, therefore it's not impossible that ghosts do exist. Scientists just haven't been able to figure out a way to detect them yet. Fair enough. We've only just fucking photographed black holes, split the atom, detected gravitational waves, proven that the Earth is a globe thanks to the Apollo missions that went to the moon, but ghosts just can't prove that any of the 109 billion people that died on Earth became a ghost without inventing some gimmicky dogshit ghost hunting device like an EMF detector, faking evidence, or just fucking lying about it. But hey, you're more than welcome to believe whatever you want. The world is your oyster. The thing is though, it's not on scientists to prove that the fictional stories people imagine up are true or false. That is for assholes on the internet like me to do. So that's why today we're taking a look at probably the stupidest ghost story I have ever read, the ghosts of Flight 401. Now this story, as far as I can tell, is considered one of the best and most credible ghost stories of all time, and has apparently even convinced some skeptics that ghosts are real, because of the sheer amount of unnamed witnesses who only ever came forward with their testimonies to one guy. So, sure, why not? That's very convincing. That's amazing. I've been waiting for a story this compelling to test my latest gimmicky skeptical asshole device, the BS detector. Now, I'm offering this device free of charge. It only uses research, reason, and logic to detect bullshit, and I recommend that you try it for yourself. Well, anyway, this intro is far too long. Let's begin. Now, as is tradition, the source of this urban legend comes from a real tragedy that affected real people. And that tragedy is Eastern Airlines Flight 401. So here's what happened. Flight 401 departed from New York on Friday, December 29, 1972 at about 9:20 p.m. And on board, it was carrying 163 passengers and 13 crew members. The plane used for this flight was a Lockheed L-1011 TriStar, which will be important later, and this flight was en route to Miami, which will also be important in a minute. Now, the captain for this flight was Captain Robert Bob Loft. He was 55 years old, had been with Eastern Airlines for 32 years, and had accumulated a total of 29,700 flight hours throughout his career. He had also logged 280 hours in the L-1011. So Bob Loft was a very experienced pilot. In the cockpit with him for this flight was his first officer Albert Stockstill. He was 39 and had about 5,800 hours of flying experience, 306 of those hours in the L-1011. The flight engineer on board for this flight was Donald Don Repo. He was 51, had about 15,700 hours of flying experience, and 53 of those hours in the L-1011. Now there was also another Eastern Airlines employee on board, just as a passenger, just returning to Miami from an assignment. And he was a 47-year-old technical officer named Angelo Donadeo. Now, according to a report by the National Transportation Safety Board, also known as the NTSB, the flight was routine until about 23:32, 11:30 p.m., when the plane would begin its approach into Miami. After lowering the gear, Stockstill noticed that the landing gear indicator, a green light identifying that the nose gear is properly locked in the down position, had not illuminated. Now the landing gear could have been manually lowered anyway, so the crew cycled the landing gear but still failed to get the confirmation light. So Captain Bob Loft, who was working the radio during this leg of the flight, told air traffic control that they would discontinue their approach to the airport and requested to enter a holding pattern, so they could obviously confirm that the front wheel is down. The approach controller then cleared the flight to climb to 2,000 feet, or about 610 meters, and then hold west over the Florida Everglades. The cockpit crew then removed the light assembly, and Don Repo was dispatched to the avionics bay beneath the flight deck to check through a small porthole whether the landing gear was indeed down. 50 seconds after reaching their assigned altitude, Loft told Stockstill to put the L-1011 on autopilot. For the next 80 seconds, the aircraft maintained level flight. Then it suddenly dropped 100 feet or about 30 meters, but then again flew level for about 2 minutes. After which it again began descending, but this time so gradually that it could not be noticed by the crew. Over the next 70 seconds, the aeroplane descended about 250 feet or 76 meters. However, this time, this was enough to trigger the altitude warning C chord chime located under Repo's workstation. Now, on Flight 401's voice recorder, there is no indication that the pilots heard the chime. In the next 50 seconds, the plane was at half of its assigned altitude. It was now flying at 1,000 feet. Unfortunately though, it seems as if the crew had no idea. So Stockstill began another turn with the plane, and this is when he noticed that something was very wrong. The flight recorder would capture Bob Loft and Albert Stockstill's final conversation. "We did something to the altitude." "What? We're still at 2,000 feet, right?" Less than 10 seconds after this, Flight 401 would crash. All 3 of the cockpit crew members, 2 of the 10 flight attendants, and 96 of the 163 passengers were killed. In total, 75 people would survive, with 58 of them suffering life-altering injuries. Now, let me just say this as a person who has a pathological fear of flying. This story is scary enough. There was no need to add ghosts to this story. But anyway, according once again to the NTSB, that landing gear light that didn't illuminate had simply burnt out. There was nothing wrong with the landing gear, it was just a burnt out bulb. However, that did consume the focus of the cockpit crew, and the subsequent crash is believed to have been caused by a subtle bump of the yoke on the aircraft. The yoke is like the steering wheel. Now, some people assume that Bob Loft bumped it with his knee while turning around to talk to Repo in the avionics bay, but I guess we'll never know because Bob Loft's ghost never mentioned it. However, the subtle bump on the yoke caused the plane to switch the autopilot from altitude hold mode to control wheel steering mode, causing the plane to begin a gradual descent. But again, because the cockpit crew was so focused on the landing gear and the faulty light bulb, and the fact that the descent was so gradual, nobody had any idea, at least until it was already too late. So that fucking sucks. But something to commend here is the rescue effort. A local airboat pilot named Sir Robert Bud Marquis was out frog gigging with Sir Ray Dickinson when they witnessed the crash. If this is your first Mystorian video and you're wondering what all the Sir shit is, I will explain it in a second. Now, after seeing this, Bud and Ray rushed to help rescue survivors. Sir Bud would receive burns to his face, arms and legs from all the spilled jet fuel, but he continued helping people anyway the whole night and the whole next day. For his courage and service, 35 years after the crash, Sir Bud Marquis received the Humanitarian Award from the National Air Disaster Alliance Foundation. as well as the Illumitech Airboat Hero Award, as well as the Mastorian's official pap of approval. I don't know what Ray Dickinson got, but for sure the pap of approval, and hopefully the same awards as Sir Bud Marquis. Now, since the plane crashed in a swamp, the swamp absorbed quite a bit of the impact and probably allowed for the 75 people to survive the crash. Now, of the 75 survivors, 67 of them were passengers and 8 were flight attendants. But despite their own injuries, the surviving flight attendants still helped other survivors and probably saved a bunch of lives by papping matchboxes out of some survivors' hands that could have ignited the jet fuel in the swamp water. Now, it seems the reason that the survivors were using matches was because at the time, flashlights and torches were not mandatory emergency equipment on planes, so they were using the matches to see in the dark. However, if they lit the matches, that could have been really fucking bad. Now, of the cockpit crew, only Don Repo survived the initial crash, along with Angelo Donadeo, who was actually in the avionics bay with Repo at the moment of impact. Albert Stockstill was unfortunately killed on impact, and Captain Bob Loft died in the wreckage of the flight deck before he could be taken to hospital. Don Repo would survive until he was evacuated to a Miami hospital, but he would later die there from his injuries. Angelo Donadeo was the only survivor of the 4 flight deck occupants. Now, this next bit may sound a bit random, but I promise that it's relevant. So I'm sure we're all big fans of the Apollo moon missions. I spent the month of February talking about them, and I called Apollo 8 the one mission that does not get the recognition, credit, or respect it deserves. Now, I don't know if you knew this, but Sir Frank Borman, commander of Apollo 8, the first crewed spacecraft to orbit the moon, was actually Eastern Airlines Senior Vice President of Operations at the time of Flight 401. Now, I personally think so highly of the Apollo missions and astronauts that if Sir Frank had to say that the Earth was flat, I would believe him. Fortunately though, he isn't a fucking moron, and he was right there when lunar module pilot Bill Anders took the iconic Earthrise photo. And since we know Apollo was real, this photo proves that the Earth is a sphere, or if you want to be a real nerd about it, an oblate spheroid. But the cherry on top is that Sir Frank also said the whole Ghosts of Flight 401 story was a load of crap. And that's just one of the many reasons that Sir Frank Borman got the Mastorian's official pap of approval. So after Flight 401 crashed, Sir Frank was woken up at about midnight by a phone call reporting the crash. He then immediately drove down to Eastern's Miami offices and chartered a helicopter to the crash site. So Sir Frank was able to land in a swampy patch of grass and coordinate rescue efforts there. He would soon accompany 3 survivors on his helicopter to hospital, including a flight attendant and a passenger who had lost her baby in the crash. That fucking sucks. Now, most of the deceased were passengers who were seated in the plane's midsection. Passengers who were seated more towards the back of the plane were more likely to survive. And another positive of crashing into a swamp was that the muddy waters of the Everglades covered the survivors' wounds and helped stop them from bleeding to death. However, the one negative about crashing in a swamp was the exact same fucking thing. The muddy waters also caused infections in some of the wounds. 8 passengers became infected and were treated with hyperbaric chambers for potential gas gangrene. Ultimately though, 60 survivors were seriously injured, sustaining fractured ribs, spines, pelvises, legs, and so on, and 17 survivors suffered minor injuries that did not require hospitalization. So yeah, that's the story of Flight 401, and it's just fucking terrible. Even though I know, according to basic Steiner math, you are more likely to die in a car than a plane crash, I still hate flying. So this kind of story is my worst nightmare. So again, in my opinion, it's scary enough as it is. But also, this is a real story that affected real people and families. So what follows is just a fucking insult to both the deceased and the survivors. And the person who made all of this up is a piece of shit. Now, apparently, according to almost every website, video, or post about this tragedy, almost immediately after the crash, even though the majority of the plane was completely mangled and destroyed, certain parts, such as the galley, were salvageable from this plane, and then installed in other L-1011s. Oh, look at that, my BS detector does work. I was beginning to worry. Now, I don't like to write fucking long winding twists in my story, I like to tell you the shit as it is. Now, according to the NTSB, The passengers in the midsection of the plane were the most likely to perish. And where was the galley located? Well, according to this diagram, the midsection. So people expect us to believe that delicate shit from this part of the plane, like ovens and food storing units and the fucking elevator that went down to the galley, crashed into a swamp, got submerged and covered in all sorts of nasty shit, and was still reused in other planes. Elevators! The most finicky, full of shit pieces of shit in the world. But somehow, it worked after a 227-mile-an-hour plane crash. I don't believe you. But that is how the story goes. And apparently, after salvaging all of these reusable parts and installing them in other L-1011s, people then started reporting ghost sightings on board other planes that were housing these reused parts almost immediately. Oh my god, we detected more bullshit. Because according to Eastern and a credible aviation writer, no parts were actually salvaged and then installed in other planes, and the first they heard of any ghost sightings at all was only 4 fucking years after the crash. The first report of any ghost sightings came from this book, The Ghost of Flight 401 by John G. Fuller. The Ghost of Flight 401, as in singular, as in only one ghost. Well, that's strange because this book reveals, quote, the 4 years between the crash and the book coming out had been filled with incidents of flight crew being startled by apparitions of Bob Loft and Don Repo appearing on board other Eastern Airline planes. So, shouldn't the book have been called The Ghosts, plural, of Flight 401? Yeah, but what the fuck do I know? It all started, according to the book, when a later L-1011 with the registration number N318EA, owned by Eastern Airlines, was on a flight to Mexico City. One of the flight attendants happened to glance at the window of an oven in the galley and saw the face of a man looking back at her. By the way, I'm referring to an article written by Brian Dunning on Skeptoid.com, who I believe, and many other people believe, has absolutely fucking definitively debunked this entire story. However, he doesn't really waste his time covering all the bullshit. So I'm going to refer to another website that does report all the bullshit, but unsurprisingly, doesn't report the explanation. So what Brian Dunning seems to be referring to is explained in a little more detail on the website Confessions of a Trolley Dolly. Quote, Flight 903 had just taken off from JFK, en route to Mexico City. Flight attendant Faye Merriweather was in the galley preparing the meals for the passengers. As she reached for the handle of the oven door, she was horrified to see the face of Don Repo staring back at her. Not one to panic, she briskly went to get a colleague and the aircraft's engineer to come and take a look. Sure enough, when they returned, Repo's face still stared out from the oven. Although, now it looked as if he was trying to say something. Suddenly, all three clearly heard the apparition mutter the words, "Watch out for the fire in this plane." I would have said, could you be a little more specific, Don? Where is the fire in the plane? But Faye and these two other unnamed people didn't think to do that. However, according to Brian Dunning on Skeptoid again, once they arrived in Mexico City, it was discovered that one of the 3 engines was damaged and would have to be replaced. Well, excuse me, but that doesn't sound like a fire. But anyway, a ferry crew was then assigned to fly it back home empty for repairs. But when they took off, one of the 2 remaining engines flamed out, forcing them to make an emergency landing on just one engine. From an aviation perspective, this was no small feat. Well, excuse me again, but is this the fire that Don Repo was talking about? Because a flameout of an engine is literally the opposite of a fire. A flameout is the unexpected extinguishment of the fire in a jet engine's combustion chamber, causing it to lose power. Well, let's just put a pin in the story for now. I will come back to it again soon, because this is basically the story Brian Dunning uses to debunk the entire thing. But I want to talk more about the ghosts first. Now, I'm not sure if this is relevant, but it's got my BS detector going off anyway, because I cannot find a record of this Flight 903. Which I suppose isn't that surprising. Nothing really happened on 903. The shit hit the fan on the subsequent flight. So I find it strange that the flight where the 2 engines went out is not specified in this story. But the flight where people saw Don Repo's face in an oven was specified. But with that said though, according to Robert Serling, the credible aviation writer I mentioned before, this emergency landing with the 2 engines bombing out did actually happen. So that I found quite surprising. But let me tell you about something that I didn't find surprising. And that is that I couldn't find a Faye Merriweather anywhere. And this is a big problem, because Faye Merriweather is the only witness who is named in this entire story. Now, just because I couldn't find her and nobody else can find her, this doesn't mean that she doesn't exist. However, it would be interesting to find an interview with her saying this shit herself. But the only source of this testimony comes from John G. Fuller's book. If this happened, she hasn't told this story to anybody else in the entire fucking world. So make of that what you will. So then, what else happened? Well, apparently, at some unspecified time in 1973, the same plane, which I'm just going to call the oven plane from now on, because I just don't feel like reciting the registration number each time, was preparing for a flight to Miami from somewhere. Somewhere unspecified. Where? Fuck you, that's where. And flying on this particular flight was one of Eastern's vice presidents. And this is great news, because if he was a big cheese of Eastern, it should be easy to find an interview of him mentioning the story as well. So,
what is your name? Detective. It doesn't matter what your name is!
His name is not specified. Just some unnamed jabroni in the story, of course. Anyways, as an unnamed VIP passenger, he was allowed on the aircraft first, and he made his way to the first class cabin. As this unnamed jabroni moves towards his seat, he notices a company captain in full uniform and goes over to have a chat with him. Now, during their conversation, Jabroni realizes that the captain he is speaking to is the deceased Bob Loft. As soon as this jabroni realizes who he is talking to, Bob Loft disappears. He then shits his pants and rushes off to find a crew member. So, there were conveniently no other witnesses. But anyways, as the story goes, Jabroni was a bit scared that this could be an omen or something, so a search of the plane was carried out before any other passengers boarded, but there was no sign of Bob Loft. Apparently then a couple of months later, at JFK Airport, an unnamed crew was boarding the same oven plane and was surprised to see Bob Loft sitting in the flight deck. So apparently, according to John G. Fuller, this crew came in, saw the ghost of Bob Loft, and they just chatted to him, not realizing who he was before he vanished right before their eyes. Now before I read the rest of what I have written here, if you worked for a company, let's say an airline or a cruise ship company, and a disaster to the magnitude of Flight 401 happened, you would fucking know about it. Also, if you are working on an airline, your team, your crew, is not that fucking big. How in the blue flaming fucking hell could you walk into the fucking cockpit, see somebody who's not on your team and just be like, well, he's just part of my team, I'm just gonna have a chat with him. These crews walk to the plane together most of the time. They know who they're working with. And I'm pretty fucking certain that you would know who Bob Loft is because Flight 401 was such a massive deal. It was such a big deal that it had a drastic impact on aviation. Pilots had to do new training courses, and flashlights and torches were introduced to all commercial planes. There is no way that you did not know who Bob Loft was. And even if you didn't, you would know that this guy in the cockpit was not part of your crew. Fuck this book and fuck this writer. Alright, let me take my blood pressure pills now. This flight was then later cancelled as the crew were too shaken to operate. What flight was this? Why can't you tell us so that we can find it and confirm that this flight was indeed cancelled because the crew saw a ghost? Which one is it? Fuck you, that's which one. So this is how most of these ghost sightings go. An unnamed crew member or passenger on an unspecified flight sees a ghost. Now, I'm not trying to say that I'd be more convinced if we had all of their names and testimonies, and all of the dates and the flight codes, but it would be harder to dismiss them all if we did have some of this information. But we don't, because the singular source, once again, seems to be John G. Fuller's book. That doesn't even know how many fucking ghosts there are. So far, we have 2 ghosts. 2 ghosts too furious. Now here's another example. During an unspecified flight from Atlanta to Miami on board the same oven plane that people have been apparently seeing ghosts, the flight deck crew were enjoying their meal as they cruised at 39,000 feet. An interesting detail, this altitude, considering that all of the crew are unnamed. When all of a sudden, there was a loud knocking coming from the hellhole. By now, these ghost stories had been circulating in the company apparently, and the crew were reluctant to go and look. Good thing that this knocking was not a mechanical failure or a fucking emergency, because they just fucking ignored it. But the knocking continued, and eventually, an unnamed flight engineer opened the hatch. And guess what was inside? Don Repo, staring back at him. Apparently though, this is the exact spot that Don Repo was when Flight 401 had crashed. Then on another occasion, several unnamed caterers loading the same oven plane for its next flight were seen rushing off it and refused to return. When asked why, they all stated that they had seen a flight engineer standing in the forward galley before vanishing. And then on another occasion, an unnamed woman sat next to an Eastern pilot who she said looked ill. She then called a stewardess only for the pilot to disappear. One more example and then I'm moving on, because I've had it with these motherfucking ghosts on this motherfucking plane. What a clever little joke that was. Another unnamed lady called an unnamed crew member because she was concerned about the unresponsive pilot sitting next to her. The pilot then disappeared, leaving the passenger hysterical. Now after these two incidents, both ladies were shown pictures of the deceased 401 flight crew, and as the story goes, both identified Don Repo as the crew member that they had seen. Excuse me for a second here. I don't believe this. What is this story trying to say here? Did Eastern Airlines show both ladies pictures of Don Repo? If so, why? Were Eastern Airlines just carrying around photos of Don Repo? And if so, why did that other unnamed crew from that other unspecified flight not fucking recognize Bob Loft? How the fuck did this story convince any skeptic that ghosts are real? You know, I thought for sure that the Orang Medan ghost ship story was the dumbest story that I was ever gonna cover on this channel, and I was genuinely sad that I would never have a stupid story like that to do again. But somehow, the ghosts of Flight 401 is the worst. Anyways, I don't know, I could keep going. There's a couple of other ghost sightings, but I don't see the point in talking about them. This is just how all the ghost sightings go. An unnamed person on an unspecified flight either sees Bob Loft or Don Repo. The only place that you can find their testimonies is in John G. Fuller's book, and the only witness that's actually named, Faye Merriweather, is impossible to find. So why is that? Why can't I ask these people about it myself? Why do I just need to trust John G. Fuller? If these people were willing to talk to him, why not anybody else then? And this is ultimately the biggest problem I have with the story. If the people commenting on these websites and articles are being genuinely serious, saying that they were skeptical about ghosts before, but now they're not so sure because there are so many witnesses, you really only have one person here, John G. Fuller. So why is that? Well, to answer that question, we have to go back to that first incident again involving the plane flying to Mexico City that had Don Repo's face appear in the oven and had the two engines bomb out. According to John G. Fuller, when the oven plane went in for repairs, mysteriously, the cockpit voice recorder was also replaced when the repair work was finally done, which struck him as odd. So John G. Fuller is claiming that they didn't only repair the engines, they also replaced the voice recorder because, in his investigations, while talking with various unnamed Eastern Airline employees, he discovered the likely reason. Don Repo had appeared in the cockpit and talked them through the landing. So, they listened to a ghost instead of air traffic control. Yeah, according to John G. Fuller. Also according to this guy, Eastern was apparently trying to cover this up. That's why they took out the voice recorder, and he said that every time an appearance of the ghost had been entered into a plane's logbook, the logbook was suddenly replaced with a new blank one. This, by the way, is also not true. But apparently he says that he was told by an unidentified mechanic who came upon a whole stockroom of equipment, all in perfect working condition, that Eastern had ordered all of these parts to be removed from various L-1011s. And these pieces were all pieces that had been salvaged from Flight 401, including the oven and the elevator, but many other pieces as well. Not important to specify. Now, one more thing. To cover his tracks, John G. Fuller said that whenever somebody told him a story of a ghost sighting, they would ask him to not use their real name, out of fear of reprisal from the company. Therefore, the book is full of untraceable sources and unverifiable claims. Well, it seems that John G. Fuller knows a lot about Eastern Airlines. Was he some sort of aviation writer? Was he an ex-employee? Was he maybe a pilot? What else has John G. Fuller written about? So John G. Fuller is full of shit. We covered the Betty and Barney Hill story in this video. And by the way, lots of people were focusing on the emphasis I made about Jupiter in that video. So I guess I just didn't convey the point I was trying to make properly. But if you watch that UFO video after this one, my point was that Betty seemed to be familiar with observing the stars and planets, since she knew which one was Jupiter. So, Betty making a star map after her alleged abduction seems to be more consistent with her fascination with the stars and planets, as opposed to her having no fucking idea what that light in the sky was, and then an alien showed her the star map of where they came from or whatever, or trade routes or whatever the fuck it was. But ultimately, her star map was of nothing, and the stains found on her dress that she was wearing that night only had traces of things from Earth. Nothing alien or even weird, except for maybe the spider DNA, which debunked the entire story. Anyway, Ghost of Flight 401 ultimately comes down to a game of my word against yours, because Robert Serling, the credible American novelist and aviation writer I mentioned earlier, wrote a book called From the Captain to the Colonel, which tells the complete history of Eastern Airlines from 1935 all the way up to 1980. This is the same credible aviation writer that confirmed that the emergency landing with 2 engines bombing out did in fact actually happen, and was covered in a tongue-in-cheek brief in the Journal of the Flight Safety Foundation. In it, a party a few weeks after the emergency landing, somebody asked one of the pilots how it had been to land an L-1011 on only 1 engine. The guy then laughed and said, "Scary. For a minute I thought Don Repo's ghost was on the plane." And this one quip appears to be the genesis of the entire story. So Brian Dunning theorizes that perhaps Fuller read it and was inspired to concoct the rest of the story. But one other very important thing we learned from Serling's history of Eastern Airlines is that the central claim of Fuller's book, that the ghosts accompanied the salvage pieces of Flight 401 installed in other planes, is false. Not a single usable part was salvaged from the wreckage, and not a single component that crashed with Flight 401 was ever installed in another aircraft. Now, John G. Fuller shit's claim that Eastern Airlines executives tried to bully their employees into silence about the ghosts led Eastern to nearly filing a lawsuit against the publisher. But Sir Frank Borman, in his infinite genius, said don't do it, because he felt that doing that would probably get the book even more publicity. But according to Eastern Airlines, quote, "Not one among the scores of Eastern officers and employees interviewed expressed any belief whatsoever in the ghost story, and they resented what they felt was Fuller's twisting or inventing of quotes." Sir Frank Borman said, "The one accurate quote in the book was made by Jim Ashlock when he called the whole story a bunch of crap." Very nice radio edit. They're the professionals. I'm the fucking YouTube guy that swears a lot. But do you know why I trust Sir Frank Borman over John G. Fuller shit? Because just like our favorite green code pointed out,
right? Why would a NASA astronaut lie?
100% right, Bart. Why would a NASA astronaut lie? Now, according to Robert Serling, an Eastern representative told him, while they were considering whether they should sue Fuller or not, the company spent weeks trying to locate anyone who claimed to have seen a ghost, and they couldn't find one single person. So who do you believe? The guy that writes bullshit books about UFOs? Or an entire company? Led by a national hero, by the way, who went to the moon. Well, in the end, Eastern decided not to sue Fuller, but Bob Loft's widow and children did. They sued him for infringement of Bob Loft's right to publicity, for invasion of privacy, and for intentional infliction of emotional distress. But for some fucking reason, the lawsuit was dismissed. So yeah, must be nice, writing absolute fucking bullshit that causes the family of the deceased distress and then being able to get away with it and make some cash at the same time. Sir Brian Dunning then goes on to put the final nail in the coffin. In 1976, 4 years after the crash, There was no such thing as convenient access to photos for the average person. Full as shit could have said whatever he wanted about the condition of the wreckage, and nobody would have any reason to doubt him. And so, with no actual ghost reports having been made by any actual people, and no haunted components from Flight 401 having been installed in other planes, it follows that the alleged orders from Eastern Airlines management to remove said components never happened either, as didn't the mechanics who performed the work and made cautious reports of it to Fuller. The Ghost of Flight 401 was a book of nearly pure fiction, as was the TV movie that followed it. Like so many such cases, its exploitation of a tragedy for financial gain and publicity was disrespectful to both the victims and the survivors." End quote. So yeah, the Ghost of Flight 401 is 401% debunked, but if we wanted even more proof, pieces of the plane's wreckage can also be found in Ed and Lorraine Warren's Occult Museum in Monroe, Connecticut. Well, if this is one of the most convincing ghost stories out there, this was really fucking bad.